we have some breaking news out of the Supreme Court. Let's bring in our chief legal affairs correspondent, Paula Reed. Paula, what can you tell us?
Yeah, look, Jim, this is one of the most significant cases that the Supreme Court was considering this term. It has to do with mifepristone, one of 2 drugs used in chemical abortion. And here the Supreme Court has decided to just toss the case entirely, arguing that the group that brought this case, that was challenging broader access to mifepristone, did not have what is called standing, which is the right to bring this lawsuit. So this was considered one of the biggest cases that the justices were reviewing this term, potentially for the impact that any decision that would have restricted access to this drug could have had, obviously on people across the country, but also potentially on the election. But here the justices, they have decided that the group that brought it, they do not have the right to do so, so they have tossed it entirely. The question they were looking at here is whether the FDA overstepped its authority in approving broader access to mifepristone. As I said, mifepristone is one of 2 drugs used in chemical abortion, which is the most widely used form of abortion in the United States. There are 2 drugs, mifepristone and the mifepristol, that are prescribed often to implement a chemical abortion. So this was obviously a hot button issue, something that could have enormous consequences. But here the Supreme Court has decided to toss the case entirely, saying that the group that brought it just didn't have standing. So we're waiting. There are other opinions this morning. We're watching and waiting to see what those are. Jim?
Yeah, Paula said, let's just let's tell our viewers about this one more time. It sounds as though what you're saying is that women who use mifepristone or want to have medication abortion can continue to do that. That is essentially what the Supreme Court has done today. That will continue to take place. And this is a defeat to anti-abortion forces who had hoped that perhaps the Supreme Court would knock out mifepristone too.
Well, Jim, I want to clarify. The Supreme Court has not really ruled one way or another on mifepristone, but on this particular challenge, they have said that they're just tossing the case. They are not going to rule one way or another on the FDA's authority generally or on this drug, but they're saying, look, the group that brought this case, they don't have standing. So they are tossing this case, arguably sidestepping the issue for now, but I would fully expect that a similar challenge could come back to the court in a different form, potentially with someone who does have standing, and then they may or may not opt to weigh in on the bigger question of broader, more easy access to mifepristone.
All right, Paula, yes, thank you for that. And I want to go to Meg Terrell. She's also with me now. Meg, put this in perspective for us. This is an important ruling that we're getting from the Supreme Court today, this rejection of this challenge.
This is an incredibly important ruling because medication abortion is the most common way that people in the United States access abortion now. It accounted for 63% of abortions in the most recent year's worth of data from the Guttmacher Institute. There were more than 1 million abortions in 2023, so that's more than 600,000 people who accessed abortion using these medications. As Paula said, though, we've heard from a lot of folks in this space who are watching this case very closely that it's not the end of this question. We are expecting potentially to see these questions come back. The fact that this is tossed out on standing, this is not going to be the end of the road for the questions around access to mifepristone. But certainly there were concerns that a ruling against the FDA in this case would roll back access to mifepristone to make it more difficult to get, especially through telemedicine, which has become an increasingly common way that people access medication abortion in the United States as more and more restrictions are put into place in different states. There were also threats to the pharmaceutical industry and to the FDA's purview. Those aren't necessarily going away if this case does come back and then is heard differently on the merits. But there were major concerns that overturning an FDA judgment through the courts would threaten the way FDA regulates medicines. It would threaten the pharmaceutical industry's ability to depend on the FDA as the key regulator of medicines, Jim.
All right, Meg Terrell, very significant development coming out of the Supreme Court. I want to bring in Gloria Borger, who's with me here in the studio. Gloria, I mean, this is a major development. I mean, obviously, if the Supreme Court had done something to take away access to mifepristone, this would have just sent shockwaves around the country.
You know, more than half of the women terminating pregnancies in this country right now use this pill.
Yeah.
And so that would have had a huge effect. Also, the people who petitioned the court wanted a prescription for this drug to have to be done in person, as Meg was saying. person to doctor rather than just getting it at your pharmacy or doing it virtually, and that won't be the case. And so, you know, as Paula was saying, they didn't decide the case. They decided the people who brought the case didn't have standing to bring the case, but it has the same impact, which is that the mifepristone can still be used in the way that it's been used for decades, and it has been deemed to be perfectly safe, and will continue to be used by more than half the women in this country who are seeking a way to have an abortion.
Fascinating. All right, and we have other folks who are standing by to weigh in on this. I do want to go to Dr. Reiner. You're with us as well. Dr. Reiner, your reaction to all this?
Well, I think, you know, obviously the Supreme Court made the right decision. There are really two drugs that are used in combination for a medical abortion. Mifepristone and misoprostol, when used together, are very effective and very safe for the termination of a pregnancy. And the FDA has approved the use of this combination of drugs for people with pregnancies less than 10 weeks of gestation. As Meg has said, it's really become the predominant means of terminating a pregnancy in the United States. And what the Supreme Court action today will help women all over the country, including in states that have severely limited abortion, to get this kind of health care.
Yeah, Ellie Honig is with us as well. Ellie, this would have just been a huge decision if mifepristone were somehow just taken off the market here as a result of a Supreme Court decision. That is not happening. It's going to remain on the market now.
Correct, Jim. So the bottom line practical takeaway is access to mifepristone remains unchanged. The status quo remains in place. What the plaintiffs were trying to do here was roll back a series of expansions in access to mifepristone that were passed in 2016 and then 2021. And the Supreme Court has left the status quo in place. The basis for their ruling, and I should note, Jim, this is actually a unanimous ruling. It was written by Justice Kavanaugh. There's one concurring opinion, but all 9 justices agreed that the plaintiffs, the people who were suing here to try to roll back access to mifepristone, did not have what we call standing. And the basic way to explain standing is, do you have a dog in this fight? What's it to you, the plaintiff? Do you have some actual injury? The group that brought this lawsuit was a group of doctors, medical practitioners, who objected to mifepristone. However, they have the right under law, various laws, to decline to prescribe mifepristone. So they tried to argue, well, but we might have to treat women who use mifepristone and then have secondary complications. And the Supreme Court said that's not enough. That's not a direct enough injury. Therefore, you don't have standing. Therefore, you lose 9-0.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just read from what Justice Kavanaugh wrote. As you said, a unanimous opinion. We recognize that many citizens, including the plaintiff doctors here, have sincere concerns about and objections to others using mifepristone and obtaining abortions, but citizens and doctors do not have standing to sue simply because others are allowed to engage in certain activities. I mean, I think, Ellie, that's what your point was. And Dr. Parnell, you're with us as well. Your reaction to the practical impact of all this?
Means that reproductive justice has prevailed, health equity has prevailed, access to care has prevailed. And what do I mean by that? What we know is that the majority of patients who need abortion care are receiving care via this prescription pill. But what's more important, it's saying that you don't need to be in person. You can get this prescription via telehealth or telemedicine. Nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and even midwives can prescribe the position to those who are in need of the care. And that's fundamentally important because we know and believe that health and healthcare is a human and civil right. So should the Supreme Court have ruled that an FDA ruling backed by science wasn't legitimate, could have been catastrophic.